Hi, Bianca Villar here, and we're still on the second part of the module on researching crisis and disasters, a historical overview, and selected methodological issues. Here we'll continue the discussion on the issues that are faced by researchers in survey research. In the previous video, we've discussed the issues related to field studies. So now what we want to see are the issues that relate to survey research. Unlike field studies, which typically employ a small number of researchers who are in face-to-face contact with the informants, survey research has a different type of relationship between the researcher and the informant. A field study is usually geared towards generation of hypotheses or propositions, while survey research seeks to test hypotheses. Each of them serve different purposes and are therefore faced with different issues in relation to time, access, and generalizability. Let's begin with the issue of time. A study by Borke and her colleagues in 2002 includes a discussion of various issues in carrying out six post-disaster survey studies. They identify three potential impediments that can affect the timeliness of collecting data through a survey research. One is the lack of questionnaire to administer. Second is a lack of an already drawn population sample. And third is a lack of funding. The first two issues are easily addressed and are closely intertwined with the overall thrust of the research group. Notably, if a researcher belongs to a group that has a predetermined vision on the types of inquiries that interest them, then a research agenda is already present, and it can be assumed that studies are already present to support the kind of questions that they want to administer. More importantly, there is a pre-validated questionnaire that can be pulled out in case a disaster or a crisis strikes. The more challenging issue, though, is the lack of funding. And in relation to this, Borke and her colleagues draw attention to a more fundamental question, and that is, how imperative is it for survey researchers to enter the area immediately? Now, this is where the nuances of the type of inquiry comes in. If a group was concerned about the reactions and actions of the victims, they have to be conscious about the distress that the victims are faced with. Similarly, from an organizational standpoint, it is often quite difficult to prod field managers and field workers for answers to yes, no, and Likert questions while they are on duty. The researcher might be a little too overbearing for those who are undertaking time-critical relief operations. Bork and her colleagues further note that there is often no definitive information as to when the distress wanes, and when in turn it is best to conduct a survey. If the researchers are not in the area, they can also administer the questionnaire through phone calls, which is a more popular means of obtaining survey data. However, telephone networks can also be overloaded or inaccessible in the immediate post-impact period. In that regard, they concluded that the question regarding timeliness of data collection is not necessarily grounded on how soon one can collect data after the disaster. In other words, unlike in field studies, survey research does not necessarily need to be carried out immediately after the disaster. The question then becomes, are some types of data perishable and subject to memory decay or memory enhancement? This was also answered by Borky and her group through three waves of data collected in different times about one disaster, which is the 1994 earthquake in Northridge, California. The first wave of data collection was conducted 8 months after the disaster, the second one was conducted 19 months after the disaster, and the third one was collected 24 months after the disaster. They found that the information collected within the 3 years since the disaster happened actually remained consistent. In the end, survey research can actually afford researchers time when collecting data. This is of course not to say that timing is less important in survey research than in field studies. The circumstances that lead to certain issues and decisions related to time in both methods are actually different. What I aim to emphasize here is that survey research is best suited in disaster and crisis settings where the information is deemed less ephemeral. Now let's look at the issue of access in survey research. There are two main issues in accessing respondents for survey research. First is related to how the survey will be administered. In more developed countries, majority of survey is conducted via phone calls. At present, emails are also used as a way to get response. Meanwhile, in less developed areas, some researchers have to actually conduct a house-to-house survey where they personally go to the household and administer the questions. Questions such as will they call back, will they pick up, or will they willingly participate are some of the concerns of survey researchers. The second issue is the representativeness of the data that researchers are able to access. This is largely related to generalizability. Generalizability depends on who and how many respondents the researchers are able to access. Taking cue from that, let's look at generalizability in survey research. Drawing valid conclusions from survey research depends on three things. First is the representativeness of samples surveyed, second is the availability of adequate control groups, and third is the appropriateness of the comparison across different surveys in the aftermath of separate disasters. Regarding representativeness, it is possible that telephone or email surveys will miss substantial numbers of persons who do not have telephones prior to the disaster. It is also possible that they miss those who are dislocated as a result of the disaster. Thus, certain statistical precautions must be undertaken to resolve this limitation. It helps if the research group already has prior access to the site before any disaster or crisis occurs. This can give them a better approximation of the population and in turn a better grasp of how to account for the representativeness of the data. Meanwhile, survey researchers are also concerned about making sure that the inference they make for a certain sample is due to the disaster experience and not affected by any factor. Control groups allow researchers to make such inferences mainly by comparing data of victims and non-victims. One way this has been addressed is the use of spatial model where exposure to disaster or crisis is identified in population groups: central, semi-periphery, and outer. This technique has been used by early disaster researchers and has been endorsed as well by Borke and her colleagues. Finally, a relatively greater codification of survey research methods can make it possible for specific comparisons across different post-disaster surveys to be undertaken. This entails a working protocol to establish the base and the conduct for administering survey. This will also resolve issues of comparability because certain definitions are made more explicit in protocols and codes. Now that concludes the two-part discussion of the second part of this module. To summarize, we said that context makes disaster and crisis research unique from non-disaster and non-crisis phenomena. This is mainly because of issues that relate to time, access, and generalizability. We saw this through the examples of methods used in disaster and crisis research, mainly in field studies and survey research. In the next and final part of this module, I'd like to use the things that we've learned so far and apply them to my own experience as I was conducting the field study for my own PhD dissertation. I hope you'll enjoy it. Till then,